why was Jesus raised on the third day? Why not the second? Why not kind of an obviously more symbolic day like the 7th or the 40th? Hi, I'm Father Thomas Aquinas Pickett here at Blessed Sacrament Parish in Seattle, Washington. Hope you're having a great day. I think this is a really interesting question. Why was Christ raised on the third day? And why is it such a big deal that, Christ himself even insists on it explicitly numerous times in the gospel? For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, Christ predicts his passion 3 times. And each time he explicitly refers to being raised on the third day. St. Paul also in 1 Corinthians 15 includes the third day resurrection as kind of an essential component of his preaching, as kind of an essential aspect of what the gospel message is about. And also, the third day appears whenever Christ kind of talks about rebuilding the temple. So in John chapter 2, Christ says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So what's going on here? Now, lots of great scripture studies, both ancient, medieval, and contemporary, point out these great connections between the third day and, for example, the prophecy of Hosea, chapter 6, verse 2. It says, "He will revive us after 2 days, and on the third day he will raise us up to live in his presence." And also, who can forget the significance of Jonah spending 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the whale, the big fish? And that's something that Christ himself refers to as well. Now, how does St. Thomas answer this question? Well, in the previous article, the Article 1 of question 53 of the third part of the Summa on the resurrection, St. Thomas provides a whole lot of scriptural arguments for why the resurrection was necessary. And if you can check that video out, there's the one before this. But today, in the second article of the 53rd question of the third part of the Summa, St. Thomas takes a very different approach to looking at the third day. St. Thomas is going to focus on what Christ's resurrection on the third day means for us. What impact does it have for us, especially for our faith? So here, he's not trying to fit kind of scriptural puzzle pieces together, but he's rather looking at what this means for the faithful. So, for example, there's different ways of looking at theological questions, okay? And I like to think of this in terms of kind of like looking at or listening to a piece of music. So, for example, imagine a classical piece of music like Beethoven's Grosse Fugue, Opus 133. It's a beast, okay? I'm a bit of a Beethoven fan, so I really like this piece, but it's notoriously complicated. Okay, it's like a double fugue. It's a big fugue. And you can look at this piece of music from a whole bunch of different angles. Okay, you can look at the score, you can analyze it from kind of a compositional point of view. You can look at it from a theory point of view. You can make connections between the motifs that Beethoven uses and other composers, like stuff that Bach or Haydn came up with. But you can also look at the same piece of music and look at, well, what does this do for the audience? What impact does this have on an audience? And for example, if you listen to this piece of music and you don't know a lot about classical music, you're not familiar with Beethoven, especially late Beethoven, it's going to sound like a mess. Okay, you check it out. I mean, it's a wild piece of music. It's going to sound chaotic. There's going to be a whole bunch of dissonance. It's going to sound really weird, almost like a 20th century art piece. But if you do know what you're listening to, if your ear is trained, and if you know enough about kind of what's going on with late Beethoven, you're going to be amazed. You're going to be amazed by this piece of music, and it's going to fill you with a sense of, I think, admiration for the genius of Beethoven. It's also going to make you very pensive. At least that's what it does for me. I always come away piece very thoughtful. I mean, it's such an intense piece, I have to think about it for a while. So, in a similar way, you can look at the third day, the resurrection of the third day. You can look at it internally, analyzing it thematically, connecting with all these other scripture verses, looking at the composition and the structure of it. But you can also look at, well, what does resurrection on the third day do for the faithful? For someone who is either, hearing the third day preached, reading it in the gospel, or pondering it as part of like Lectio Divina or their spiritual meditation. It's still a theological way of looking at it, but it's more focused on the impact rather than the internal essence of what's going on. And that's what St. Thomas is doing here. When he's looking at the third day, he's going to look at, well, what impact does this have on the faithful? And he notes right off the bat, following from what he said in the previous article, that the resurrection of Christ was necessary for helping our faith. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it was necessary, was to instruct us to be able to know and to love who it is that we have faith in. Resurrection is necessary for the instruction of faith. Now, what our faith is centered on, or who our faith is centered on, according to St. Thomas, is Christ, right? Back in the second part of the Summa, question 2, article 7, St. Thomas says, the object of faith includes properly and directly that thing through which man obtains beatitude. Now, the mystery of Christ's incarnation and passion is the way by which men obtain beatitude. Therefore, belief of some kind in the mystery of Christ's incarnation was necessary at all times and for all persons. When you're looking at faith, when you're looking at what faith looks at, it's very Christocentric. It's looking at Christ, his life and his death and his resurrection. So St. Thomas is going to think that the resurrection of Christ has something really important to say to us. It's going to enliven and inform our faith and our knowledge and our love of Christ in some way. And what St. Thomas zooms in on is that the resurrection on the third day clarifies specifically both the divinity and the humanity of Christ. As St. Thomas says, for it's not enough to believe the one without the other. You have to have both of these, the humanity and the divinity of Christ. And we know as Christians, we've historically, it's been a long time of trying to find that fine line of finding, well, what does that mean? Because we've had to fight so many different heresies. Early on, we have the Arians, who say that Christ is 100% human, 0% divine. And then you have the flip side a little later with the Docetists, who say he's 0% human, but 100% divine. Then you have the Nestorians, or at least how the Nestorians were understood back in time, which is that he's 100% human and he's 100% divine, but he's almost kind of like two different things that kind of work in sync. And so the Catholic Orthodox understanding eventually was that, no, Christ is 100% human, 100% divine, but he's one. He's one person, one reality. And so with that in the background, St. Thomas is going to look at the third day resurrection, and he says, aha, this affirms both the divinity and the humanity of Christ at the same time. This is amazing. So in order to believe that Christ was truly God, he should rise quickly from the dead, in order to show that he's got the power, that death does not have power over him, that death doesn't have the last word. He's God. He has the power. But on the other hand, to show that he was really and truly human, he has to stay dead. He has to stay dead for a sufficient amount of time, to avoid people thinking, he might have been faking it. Or, yeah, that wasn't a real death. Maybe he was just kind of like in a coma or something like that. So St. Thomas says he sees 3 days. And he says, that's perfect. That's the perfect amount of time to prove both. It's quick enough to affirm his power as God, and it's long enough to affirm the truth of his death. The one points to his divinity, the other points to his humanity. Now, in the second article of question 53 of the third part, St. Thomas goes on a little bit to throw in some kind of funky mystical arguments, or kind of like icing on the cake. Okay, this is after his main argument. He kind of goes, well, there's also a lot of cool stuff you can do with the number 3. Okay, and you gotta love medievals and ancient Christians. They did this all the time. It's fun. So, for example, 3. 3 is very important because everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's 3 components there. So St. Thomas says, well, that makes sense because there's like 3 eras. There's 3 epochs. There's 3 times of salvation history. There's the time before the law. There's the time under the law, and then there's the time of grace. And so he sees the 3rd day as symbolically instituting the 3rd age, the age of grace. So the 3rd age of salvation begins on the 3rd day of the resurrection. Now, tomorrow, what we're going to look at is the 3rd article of question 53. And this is kind of an interesting one. And maybe if you watch this video, take a little time to think about this. He asks the interesting question, was Christ the first person to rise from the dead? Okay? And if you know your scripture, you know that this might be a little tricky to answer. Was Christ the first person to rise from the dead? So, in review, St. Thomas is looking at the 3rd day as a way that Christ is helping our faith. Okay? And what does it help? It helps us to really see truly that he is both divine and human. And this should strengthen our faith, it deepens our faith, and for us who are in the 3rd age, of the age of grace, it should be a cause of great joy and celebration. So I hope you have a great rest of your Easter Saturday, and stay healthy, stay holy, and stay awesome. Okay, God bless you all.